There is one single line of code which is more famous than perhaps any other in the entire world of GameMaker. Even more so than Sean Spaulding's collision code, or Cosmo's dialogue system, or even the much maligned game Restart. This is a line of code which has been used in many GameMaker games and projects and demos and tutorials and forum posts over the years. And whether you've been using GameMaker for your entire life, or whether you just showed up here a week or so ago, perhaps you might be, for example, an expatriate from an engine who's currently in the running for this year's Darwin Award, this is a line of code that's worth knowing why it works, and knowing why it's everywhere, and you might have even heard that this line of code has a bit of a bad reputation, and it's probably worth knowing why it probably doesn't deserve that bad reputation. And that line of code is depth equals negative y. So why this is useful is if you have a game that is being presented from a top-down perspective like this one, and if you have a bunch of objects in your game, and you want them to correctly overlap each other such that the objects that are farther up the screen are drawn behind objects that are farther down on the screen, so that I can walk in front of, for example, this pile of grass, but if I were to walk up a little bit, I should probably go behind it. And depth equals negative y is a handy tool for what is known as automatic depth sorting. And instead of requiring the player to automatically, or instead of requiring you as the developer to automatically keep track of which objects are where and how to draw them in order, you can use depth equals negative y as a quick and easy, and also, I might add, very efficient means of having GameMaker automatically sort which objects are to be in front or behind each other. So I'll get into why this works and how it works and all that in just a moment, but first let me actually implement this. I'm going to go into the parent object of all of the objects that are drawn in the game world that I want to be depth sorted, so that'll be like parent object underscore thingy. I'm very good at naming things. I'm going to go into, let's say, the end step event, and I'm going to write depth equals negative y. And with that one small change, we should have everything pretty much sorted out. So not only are all the different clumps of grass now correctly layered, not only are all the clumps of grass that are farther down the screen are being drawn above the ones that are farther up, but also objects that are moving around, such as the player. When I'm walking through grass like this, these here dogs, when they're walking through grass like this, they are also being correctly layered. And that is the power of depth equals negative y. It's not often that you get to say that you can fix a problem like this with one single line of code, but this is one of the rare occasions where that is the case. So first I'll explain why this works, and it's quite simple. So in GameMaker, objects with a high depth value are, as far as the engine is concerned, drawn before everything else. The suggestion being that objects that are farther away from the camera have a higher depth value. They have a greater distance to the camera. And therefore, the larger the object's y coordinate is, the more negative it will be, and objects with a, shall we say, more positive depth value are always drawn before objects with a more negative depth value.
Hey.
And so objects that are farther down the screen will be drawn on top of objects that are higher up the screen. And yes, this does mean that objects with a negative depth are still visible to the camera, but since x, y, and depth in GameMaker is more of a 3D coordinate than an actual distance from the camera, then that's perfectly allowed because the default GameMaker cameras are able to handle 3D coordinates like that. So as great as this line of code is, there are a few situations where this might start to fall apart a little bit. Let me go and take a bit of a taller grass spray, and let me use that and draw that instead of the one that's the same size as the player. And you can see that the grass sprites themselves are still layered correctly, but there are some situations where, for example, the duck character can walk over the grass sprites, and that is that comes down to the position of the sprite origins, GameMaker sprite origins. And depending on what you have your sprite origin set to, this could be more or less of a problem. But if your sprite origin is in the middle center, then any object that has that sprite, the object will originate from the center. And if you have a tall sprite like this next to a somewhat shorter sprite like this duck, can I have these? I cannot have these overlap. All right. Well, I'll just put them next to each other. Alright, fine, I'll use an image viewer. This is why people don't like workspaces. But anyway, if you have a tall sprite like this grass next to a shorter sprite like this duck, and they both have their sprite origin in the middle, then as soon as the middle of the duck sprite goes below the middle of the grass sprite, it'll be sorted below, and as soon as it goes above, it'll be sorted behind. And what we really want for depth sorting here is when the bottom of the duck sprite goes in front of the grass, we want it to be sorted in front rather than the middles. And to accomplish that, you can either set the sprite origin of each and every one of your sprites in your game to the bottom center or the bottom left or the bottom right or something like that. But that is that can be a little tedious, and that can possibly mess up some other things in your game if your game is reliant on your sprite origins being in certain places. So instead what you can do is you can edit the line depth equals -y to depth equals -b box bottom. And now, when I run this example, instead of having to mess with the sprite origins to get the duck sprite to be in front of the tall grass and for the duck sprite to be correctly behind the tall grass and all the other things, this will just work, because now b-box bottom is... Let me bring these two sprites back. b-box bottom is going to be the coordinate, the y-coordinate of the lowermost part of the sprite, and that'll be in world space, so that'll already be factoring in not only the size and shape of the sprite's collision box, but also the position of the object. And now, the 2 points that are going to be compared for depth sorting are going to be on the bottom of each of the objects rather than the middle, and that will be much more accurate when it comes to figuring out if an object should be behind another. And it's worth pointing out that b-box bottom is specifically going to look at the collision mask of a sprite, so if your sprite has some funny shaped collision mask, then this might not necessarily work as well, and you might have to do a little bit more work working out things like sprite get b-box bottom. So if you have some funny collision mask set to your sprite, you're going to want to type out this somewhat longer line of code, sprite get b-box bottom minus sprite get y offset plus y. And this is effectively what the b-box bottom property of an object is going to calculate anyway from the collision mask. So the bounding box bottom of the actual sprite minus the y-coordinate of the sprite origin plus the y position of the player. Doesn't roll off the tongue quite as well as depth equals -y, but for practical purposes, it should suit your needs.
Hey.
That said, I'm gonna go back to -b-box bottom for the time being, just because I like it. So now, hopefully you see why this line of code is so useful for games from a top-down perspective. And this doesn't just have to be used in games that are like a Pokemon-like, or a 2D top-down Legend of Zelda-like, or like Final Fantasy-like, or anything like that. This should work perfectly well for any game which has a top-down perspective which you want to have objects layered like this. Now, I did say that I would talk about, if you want to call it, the controversy surrounding depth equals -y, and why some people don't like it, and why I think a lot of the naysayers are kind of missing what's actually going on here. And that is the matter of performance. So, right now, I'm spawning 200 of these random grass objects, and before I spawn any more, let me change the grass object to something a little smaller just so that you can actually see the duck over the top of them. Yeah, let's go with these flower sprites. There's a bunch of different variations of flowers in this sprite, and this object will pick a random one. But let me spawn, say, instead of 200, let me spawn 20,000 of them. And we're going to have a look at performance. So let me run the game. It'll take a second to start up because we do have to instantiate 20,000 flowers, but once it's going, you can see that aside from the fact that we have to draw 20,000 flowers, the performance of this really isn't bad. And just in case you think that like FPS real might be bumped up a great deal by commenting out depth equals -b-box bottom, not really. It's not nothing. I think we've gone from about 60 FPS underscore real to about 80 or 90 just by commenting out that one line of code. But it's also not terrible. And again, most of the time that it takes to draw this scene is coming from the fact that we actually have to draw 20,000 flowers, and not the fact that we're trying to depth sort them. You can attempt to get around this by saying if depth is not equal to -b-box bottom to only do the depth sorting if you're if you haven't already been sorted. But this really isn't going to net you any performance gains because GameMaker will already do this for you. GameMaker will not resort the depth of a sprite in the object hierarchy if it doesn't need to. And we can see that by doing this performance test. You can actually go inside the HTML5 source code, now that that's on GitHub, and you can look at it and you can see what it's doing for yourself. This will start to become a slight problem if... let me go back to grass here. This will start to become a slight problem if, for example, every object is moving on its own. And that's HP, that's not V-speed. Alright, let's move vertically. We need their actual Y positions to change. If every object is moving and constantly has to be updated in the object hierarchy, then you're going to see slowdown, but most people, I think it's safe to say, are not going to be making games where they have 20,000 objects that are all moving and all need to be depth sorted like this every frame. This is very much an extreme and probably not realistic case. If you were to try to depth sort such a thing yourself anyway, you would be seeing similar performance. That's just the nature of having 20,000 objects that are all moving at the same time in GameMaker. Some people have also raised concerns over the years about if you were to depth sort objects like this in GameMaker, the GameMaker would create a new layer inside the room for every unique depth, and you would basically get a runaway memory leak because of that, but that is also really not the case. If I run this now, how much memory is this going to take up? If I look in the debugger, where is the debugger? We're sitting at about 36 megabytes of memory. Oh no, that's average. Yeah, 36.5 megabytes of memory. And if I were to not depth sort like this, if I were to comment this out again and not do that depth sorting, we would be sitting at pretty much the same. Alright, 34.5, 36, so it's going to tick up to about 36.5. So, I don't remember if in the very early days of GameMaker Studio 2 if that was actually a problem or not. But rest assured, you don't really have anything to worry about depth sorting 20,000 objects unless they're all being updated in every step. Lastly, and I think this is another one of those probably not very realistic scenarios, but I do think it's kind of funny, so I do want to talk about it. If your depth were to exceed negative 16,000, so let me set the height to something like 20,000. This is going to be a very long room. Let me go in the tile layers and just flood fill the rest of this room. So this is going to be a very long room. It's going to be 20,000 units tall. And I'm going to just basically take the player, and I'm going to have the player walk all the way down to the bottom. Let me also... So I'm just going to draw the player's Y position on the screen, and I'm going to walk all the way down to the bottom of the room. That's going to take like 3 minutes. It might be easier a little bit if I were to spawn the player closer to the bottom of the room, but you know what? We're going to start walking. So... this is going to create a problem where the depth of the UI layer, like in GameMaker, GameMaker's GUI layer, is sitting on depth equals negative 16,000. And this is one of those silly things that I feel like it shouldn't need to do. Like, I feel like the UI layer in GameMaker should just be completely independent from, like, regular depth, but for better or for worse, that's how Yo-Yo Games decided to do it. And 16,000 pixels of space down is honestly a truly staggering distance. You can see how far I'm having to run in order to get there. I suppose I could have just spawned the player this far down instead of running the whole way, but to be honest, I feel like running drives home the point a little bit better of just how far we have to go to make this happen. So you can see I crossed over depth equals, Y equals 16,000 in the positive direction, depth equals negative 16,000. And the UI layer disappears. That's... yeah. I don't know if that's going to be considered quote-unquote a bug that GameMaker ever fixes, or if that's just how it works and that's how it's going to stay. But if you do have a truly and ridiculously tall room in GameMaker, this is something that can happen. Really, you're probably going to start running into so many other issues before you even get anywhere close to this that this is going to be a non-issue for most people.
Hey.
Somewhere around this point, you're probably going to start running into like floating point errors, honestly. And I believe that's actually what's happening as to why I'm suddenly at like 16,000.17 on my y coordinate, despite the fact that I'm moving in integers, like, you know, increments. But why did my asset browser get zoomed out? That's pretty much all I have to say about depth equals negative y in GameMaker itself. A semi-popular alternative that has sprung up in the last few years to depth sorting in this way is to create vertex buffers out of all your sprites and to enable the depth buffer and to enable depth testing and use the depth buffer to automatically sort things like this. And far be it from me to tell people not to use 3D in GameMaker and to not use vertex buffers and stuff in GameMaker, but honestly, for most games, that's really kind of overkill. For most games, if you want to make a game that looks anything like what my demo looks like here, depth equals negative y or depth equals negative b box bottom is more than sufficient. And while I think the vertex buffer trick or the sprite tilting trick, or Z tilting I think is the most popular name for it, while I do think that's interesting and does lead to some other cool things you can do in GameMaker, I really wouldn't recommend spending a sufficient amount of time over-engineering a solution like that for a problem like this, which can be just solved in a line of code. Anyway, I'm going to end this off here. My name is Michael. I like wizards and dragons and making games. If you want the code for this demo, look for the GitHub repository down in the video description. I try to post about 2 game dev videos a week, one tutorial like this. I do like to talk about weird 3D things that you can do in GameMaker, and also other things from time to time. And one, Let's Make a Game, currently a 3D Zelda-like. So if any of that appeals to you, feel free to subscribe. I have a Patreon, so if you want to contribute to the channel, links to that can be found in all the usual places. Otherwise, I hope you all find this useful, and I will see you all later. Special thanks to Army Armbuster, DJ Gibbles, Edward Holt, GameMaker, Gamer Player, John Luigi Celentano, Manta Ray, Syndra Larson, Squarecrow, Vitro V, and Zenjament for supporting these videos. If you want to contribute to the channel, head on over to the Patreon page down in the video description to join the fun.